Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a seriously fascinating, and I mean profound, journey into the absolute depths of the human mind. We're going to explore how one of the 20th century's most brilliant psychologists, Carl Gustav Jung, ventured deep into his own unconscious and came back with a framework that would change how we view the psyche forever. We are diving into Jung and Gnostic thought, uncovering how these incredibly ancient myths actually hold the key to modern personal growth. So get ready. We're about to discover a universe of whole-making. Okay, let's dive into this. When you hear the word Gnosticism, you probably think of, early Christian heretics or these forgotten mysterious cults from antiquity. But we have to ask a much more provocative question here. Is it really just some forgotten religion, or is it actually the very first depth psychology? The noted scholar G. Filoramo made this brilliant point. He noted that Jung's reflections were so deeply immersed in ancient Gnostic thought that Jung essentially looked at the Gnostics as the virtual discoverers of depth psychology. They weren't just writing strange, fantastical myths. They were literally mapping the inner workings of the human mind centuries before modern psychology was even a concept.
Now, to really grasp this, we need to get our definition straight. Gnosis does not mean belief. It doesn't mean faith. It translates to knowledge, but specifically direct, experiential knowledge of spiritual reality and the awakening of this divine spark within you. You see, the Gnostics believed that salvation didn't come from just blindly obeying some distant creator up in the sky. No, it came from looking inward. They believed that by deeply, truly knowing yourself, you awaken a hidden, divine light that's trapped inside the material world. And for Jung? Well, this ancient pursuit of gnosis perfectly mirrored the modern psychological journey of self-discovery.
Jung's view on how we relate to our own unconscious mind is just fascinating. He describes it as a descent into the dark, hot depths of the psyche. In fact, Jung believed that modern humanity's absolute worst sin is our unconsciousness, the way we just sleepwalk through life. But here's the catch. We don't go back down into the unconscious just to regress into some primitive, chaotic state. That's not the point. The actual goal is to plunge into those depths, withstand the dangers lurking there, and bring those hidden symbols back up into the bright light of consciousness. It is, quite literally, a rescue mission for your soul.
Section 1. Mapping the Psyche. The Gnostic Encounter.
So, during World War I, Jung confronted his own unconscious in his famous Red Book, and he realized that ancient Gnostic myths provided a literal map for the modern mind. Take the Gnostic Demiurge, for instance. In their mythology, the Demiurge is this blind, arrogant, lesser deity who mistakenly thinks he is the supreme god. He creates the flawed material world and is completely, entirely ignorant of the higher spiritual realms. Now compare that to Jung's psychological translation, the inflated ego. When our ego assumes exaggerated importance and completely disconnects itself from the deeper wisdom of the unconscious, it becomes exactly like the Demiurge. It thinks it runs the whole show. And this kind of inflation seriously distorts our psychological development, leading to a massive imbalance because it willfully ignores the huge unconscious forces that are actually driving our behavior.
Next up, we have the incredibly beautiful and tragic myth of Sophia. In Gnosticism, Sophia represents the divine feminine. She tragically falls from the perfect spiritual realm known as the pleroma, all the way down into the dense, dark material world, and she desperately needs redemption. Jung looked at this story and instantly recognized its psychological twin, the anima. The anima is the feminine aspect of the male psyche, and just like Sophia, the anima can become totally alienated from our conscious ego. When that happens, she gets projected onto the literal outer environment, like onto the women in a man's life. Finding Sophia within yourself, rescuing her from the trap of the material world, is the exact same process as a man integrating his inner anima to find real soulful vitality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal of both systems. The Gnostics talked a lot about the anthropos. This is the primordial unified human being. We're not talking about a literal flesh and bone person here, but rather a grand, perfected image of a human that encompasses both the divine and the mortal, the spiritual and the material. Jung drew a direct, undeniable parallel between the anthropos and what he called the self. While your ego is just the tiny center of your conscious awareness, the self represents your total personality in potentia. It's the ultimate integration of your conscious mind and your deep, vast unconscious. It is the absolute archetype of complete psychological wholeness.
Now, at the absolute heart of Gnosticism is this intense, unavoidable dualism. There is a fierce conflict between the oppressive material world created by that arrogant demiurge and the hidden immaterial sparks of light that are trapped inside of it. Psychologically speaking, Jung saw this dualism as our classic struggle with the shadow. Your shadow contains all the repressed, hidden, and frankly rejected parts of your personality. Just as the ancient Gnostic had to realize that divine sparks were trapped in the darkness of matter, we have to recognize and integrate our own dark, hidden shadow if we ever want to achieve true psychic balance. You simply cannot have the light without acknowledging the dark.
To process this incredibly intense integration, Jung leaned heavily into alchemy, which, by the way, is deeply intertwined with Gnostic thought. Alchemy wasn't actually about some medieval wizard turning literal lead into gold. It was a profound metaphor for the transformation of the human soul. And this transformation happens in three brutally difficult stages. First, you have negredo, the blackening, or the darkness. This is where we face our inner chaos and experience the painful death of our old ego. Second is albedo, the whitening or awakening, where a kind of inner purification happens and true insight dawns on us. And finally, rubedo, the reddening or rebirth. This is where the opposites are finally unified and the integrated whole self is born.
To navigate these crazy stages, the unconscious speaks to us using a language of universal archetypes. Let's decode a few of these striking esoteric symbols that Jung explored. First up, the mandala. In Sanskrit, it simply means circle, but psychologically, it is the ultimate tool for establishing inner order. It represents the total wholeness of the self. Next, the Ouroboros, that ancient, iconic image of a dragon or snake eating its own tail. Sure, it represents cyclical time, but psychologically, it perfectly captures the unconscious process of self-destruction and endless recreation. And finally, the Philosopher's Stone. The ancient alchemists spent their lives seeking this magical object, but Jung knew the secret. It was actually a symbol for realizing your ultimate inner potential, the golden actualized self. Section 2. The Return. Individuation and Wholeness.
So, what does this all mean? Well, all of these ancient myths lead to one very practical destination: individuation. This right here is the modern psychological equivalent of gnosis. Individuation is Jung's term for the lifelong, incredibly rewarding journey of becoming exactly who you are meant to be. But it's not easy. It requires dragging the hidden, chaotic contents of your unconscious out into the bright light of consciousness. Just like the ancient Gnostic who sought salvation by realizing their divine origins, the modern individual achieves real psychological health only by wrestling with their inner darkness and integrating those messy forces into one unified whole.
Think about it like this. Jung notes that consciousness actually arises out of the unconscious, not the other way around. Back in our primitive state, the human ego was incredibly weak. We were almost entirely unconscious, projecting our inner realities outward onto the world. We literally created gods and monsters out of our own psychology. The task of modern humanity is to finally differentiate the ego from the unconscious. We have to stop projecting our shadow onto everyone else and instead consciously pull that material back inside ourselves. We have to do the hard, gritty work of making the unconscious conscious.
And what actually happens when you do that work? You achieve an unshakable, profound inner certainty. In a famous 1959 BBC interview, a journalist asked Jung if he believed in God. Jung paused for a moment and then delivered this legendary response: "I do not believe in God, I know." Now, Jung wasn't talking about a traditional man up in the clouds. He was expressing that through his grueling psychological work, through holding the agonizing tension of massive opposites within his own mind, he had a direct, unquestionable encounter with the numinous self. He didn't need blind belief anymore, because he had achieved pure, undeniable gnosis.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If Gnosticism is indeed a map of your very own mind, and the ultimate goal of life is to rescue the fragmented pieces of your soul from the dark, what sparks of the divine are you currently ignoring in your own unconscious? What shadow elements are you pretending just don't exist? The map has been drawn by the ancients, and it's been brilliantly clarified by Jung. The only question left now is whether you have the courage to make the descent. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep exploring your inner labyrinth.